Chapter 7. Sunday, May 23, Sup RD/Sup, 1852. It is finally the men's rest day. I'm weary of walking beside the wagon all day every day, but I know this journey is not even half over, and so I don't dare start complaining or I will never stop. Malcolm is feeling very strongly about me being kind to Mr. Bedwell and his sons, and though I don't know why it's so important to him, I'm determined to do as he wants. I've asked God to soften my heart toward the man so that I can be more kind to him by doing things he needs. I have agreed to make a loaf of bread for his family every day when I make a loaf for mine, and his family is coming to supper tonight. We shall see what I am moved to say and do from there. I thought we had Annie past the point where she felt as if she needed to earn her keep, but she seems to still feel like she needs to do for us, so we won't leave her behind. I pray every day that she understands that we want nothing from her, and only want to give to her, but so far, my prayers haven't been answered. I do hope that supper with the Bedwells joining us goes well, but I have my apprehensions. Supper that evening was a great deal more pleasant than Betty had anticipated. Mr. Bedwell and his sons behaved as perfect gentlemen, and she was happy to give them 2 loaves of bread and their share of the dried meat. She knew it might get to be boring to eat the same things all day, but she also knew how hungry they were by the way they devoured the food she'd fixed. It was the right thing to do to keep them fed, and she would do her share to keep it happening. I'll plan to make you 2 loaves of bread every day, she told Mr. Bedwell. Just make sure you keep bringing me flour and sugar, and I'll make it happen. I have enough yeast for now, but I will probably ask for more of that as well. We're just happy the food won't go to waste, Mr. Bedwell told her. I tried to cook, but I only made a mess. He looked embarrassed as he said it, and it suddenly struck Betty what a proud man he was. No wonder he'd been in hiding. Everyone blamed him for his own wife's death, and no one thought he should be their captain any longer. His pride had kept him from being able to look anyone in the eye. That's for sure, Mr. Bedwell's younger son said. He shook his head. Pa is a walking disaster when it comes to cooking. Annie giggled. My mama is a really good cook. She is, Bedwell's older son said. I wish we could eat with you for every meal. He looked sad, as if he knew their family wasn't welcome with others, and Betty's heart broke a little for them. If you'll supply your share of the food, I'll cook for you, Betty said automatically. But just in the evenings. I'll make sure you have bread for the next day, and I'll split what we have left from supper. You'll be on your own for breakfast. It was a truly generous offer, and she knew it. In a way, she hoped they would say no, because it would mean a lot more work for her, but she couldn't let the boys go hungry, and she couldn't feed them without feeding the father. No, it had to be that she fed them all if she wanted to be able to live with herself. Mr. Bedwell looked at her in shock. Are you certain you don't mind? I'm certain, she said. She looked over at Annie. And after Annie's arm is fixed, she'll help, won't you? Annie nodded. I will help. I have to earn my keep. Betty frowned to hear Annie use those words again, but she decided to wait until later to discuss it with her. As Mr. Bedwell stood, Betty shook her head. Aren't you staying for dessert? She asked. She didn't always make dessert, but now that she knew Malcolm's fondness for sweets she tried. Dessert? Mr. Bedwell quickly sat down again. You made dessert? She laughed. I did make dessert. It's just raisin bread, but it's pretty tasty. And she was thankful she'd made 3 loaves. She'd spent the bulk of the day cooking and baking, but being able to bless another family with food made her happy. She cut up the bread she'd made for their dessert, slathering each piece with butter, and handing them out. Then she took a basket that had 2 loaves of regular bread, and 1 loaf of raisin bread in it. This is for tomorrow. She handed the loaf to the former captain, who seemed to be stunned. Thank you. You're welcome. If you'll make sure to return the basket every evening, I can fill it again. Betty sat back down, and when her eyes met Malcolm's, he nodded slightly. He was obviously pleased with her kindness. "If you can bring your cook pot over, I can put some of what's left from tonight in it for your noon meal tomorrow." She'd made a good amount more than double what she usually made, so it should be enough for both families for one more meal each. Bedwell's oldest son jumped to his feet and ran back to their wagon. Betty laughed. "I think he wants some of our supper to eat tomorrow." Bedwell laughed too, shaking his head. "That boy has hollow legs. He'd rather eat than breathe." By the time the other family left their campsite, Malcolm had an entirely new view of his wife. "Thank you for being so kind to them. We are the first people who have shown them any kindness since his wife died." Betty nodded. "I had a feeling that was true. I have to admit, I still harbored some very bad feelings for Mr. Bedwell, but I prayed about it, and I think it's the right thing to do to help them. Even if I didn't want to help Mr. Bedwell, his boys didn't do anything wrong. They'd run wild a bit after their mother's death, but that was the extent of their bad behavior." "No, they didn't." "Thank you." Betty nodded as she got down to the work of doing the dishes. There would be more dishes from now on, but she refused to complain, no matter how much she hated doing them. Hopefully, it would teach Mr. Bedwell and his family all about kindness. And maybe, if she prayed really hard, one of them would offer to help her wash the dishes every night. After the dishes were done and the clean laundry was put away, Betty felt ready to drop. Her day off had been the hardest day she'd had in a while, but it was all right. Staying busy would keep her out of mischief. She believed what her mother had always told her about idle hands being the devil's workshop. Little good ever came from someone who was filled with boredom. She was certain that was how the egg incident had started with her nephews. Amanda and Sally came over and immediately went to bed with Annie, and Malcolm and Betty pitched their own tent to sleep in. It wasn't the kind of privacy they wanted, but at least they felt like they could hold one another through the night with no one watching them. Betty's last thought before falling asleep was wondering just how she'd been able to sleep before she had Malcolm holding her. Before the wagon started rolling the following morning, Betty noticed a woman she hadn't seen before. She walked over to introduce herself after swallowing down her shyness. "I'm Betty Bentley." "Oh, you're the one who married the doc." The woman nodded, as if she'd at least heard of her. "I am. I haven't met you before. Don't you walk with the other women?" Betty didn't know of many women who drove their family wagon the way Margaret had. The woman shook her head. "No, I'm not married, and I'm not sure I ever want to be." She shrugged. "Sometimes being married means giving up too many freedoms." "So, you're on the trail alone?" Betty was surprised. She knew Margaret had been a woman alone on the trail, but that was different. She'd had her girls with her. "Yup. I'm alone. I'm Penelope Brainerd." "It's so nice to meet you, Miss Brainerd." Betty was determined to meet as many people as she could. It was a personal challenge now. No longer would she hide from others, but instead, she'd embrace the people around her. "Oh, just call me Penelope." "I will then." "Thank you. And you'll have to call me Betty. I haven't been Mrs. Bentley for long enough to learn to answer to that name yet." Betty found she wasn't fond of her name anyway. Betty Bentley sounded like an antagonist in a novel. No, she'd ask everyone she could to use her first name. It was better for her in every way. Penelope laughed. "That sounds really good, Betty." She brushed her hands off. "Well, I need to get to driving. It was nice meeting you. Would you come for supper tonight?" Betty asked, surprising herself. She didn't even know what she was cooking for supper, and here she was inviting a random stranger. And then she remembered she had all the Bedwells coming to supper as well. She had to come up with something to eat fast. "I'd be happy to." "Thank you." Penelope seemed genuinely surprised and happy to be able to eat with other people for a change. Betty smiled. "I'll see you then." As she walked back over to get in line with the rest of the women, she smiled. She'd made 2 new friends with no prompting. She was really getting better at meeting people and not being so terribly afraid. Of course, both had been women. It was a good deal harder for her with men. She had to wonder how many people even knew Penelope was part of their wagon train. She was a nice enough woman, but she wasn't walking with the other ladies, so it would be hard for her to get to know people, especially other women on the trip. As she walked with the other women, she thought about the new woman she'd met, thinking about all the people she had avoided meeting for a month and a half as she'd kept her nose stuck in a book as much as possible. Now it was as if a whole new world had opened up for her. A scary world, with a great deal of people in it, but a world that she needed to learn to navigate as the doctor's wife. "What are you ladies making for supper tonight?" she asked. "I've invited people over, and I have no idea what to make." Mary laughed, her musket slung over one shoulder as usual. "You need some fresh meat. Want me to try to get you some?" Betty thought about it for a moment. "Yes, but nothing too large, I don't think. I have a lot of dried meat right now, and I know we can never really have enough, but I worry about overcrowding my wagon with it all." Mary shrugged. "If I get something of good size, we'll all divide it up tonight and use it all. No drying necessary." Mrs. Mitchell, Mary's mother, nodded. "I wouldn't be opposed to having fresh meat on my campfire this evening." She wasn't the most vocal woman in their group of ladies, but she had a great deal of knowledge about many things. Betty respected her a great deal. Mrs. Mitchell made her miss her mother more every day. Mary smiled. "I'm going to walk over further from the wagons then. I'll have better luck spotting something." Without thinking, Betty asked, "Would you like some company?" "I would love some." Mary didn't seem to think it was strange that Betty had offered, but Bernice and Margaret gave her strange looks. Betty walked with Mary toward the south. The river ran almost due west, so they were following that, and going further to the south took them further from the wagons. "What are we looking for?" Betty asked. "No idea, but we'll know it if we see it. I'd rather something like a deer or antelope. I've seen some playing south of the river on the prairie. They don't like to be too close to humans, so it's easier to just find them here. You help me spot them." Betty nodded. She wanted to be useful, and she was the one who needed fresh meat after all. Well, they all did, but she'd been the one to ask for it. They walked in a line parallel to the river, just further from it than usual. When Betty spotted a pretty white-tailed doe, she pointed it out. "I hate the idea of killing something so pretty," she said softly. The doe was simply majestic as it stood, staring off to the south and away from the ladies. Mary shook her head. "She has a fawn with her. I'm not going to leave that critter without a mama. My younger siblings would decide they needed to keep the fawn as a pet." Betty laughed. "Doesn't sound like that would be a good idea." She was amused by Mary and her boyish ways. She was half mother hen and half great hunter, and so unlike anyone Betty had ever known. Not at all. As they kept walking, Mary asked, "How's married life? You and the doc doing well?" Betty nodded. "We really are. I don't think I had an idea of just how good of a man he was until after I married him, but he's pretty wonderful. Yeah, everyone talks about what a good man he is." Mary smiled. "I'm pretty fond of Bob, I have to say." Betty grinned. "He seems like a good man, as far as Bobs go." "Oh, he is." Betty pointed to her left, and Mary nodded. "A buck. And he was a big one." Mary put her musket to her shoulder and took careful aim and brought the beautiful creature down with just one shot. Betty felt sad when he died, but not as sad as she would have felt with no meat to serve guests for supper. The two women dragged the deer back to the wagons, and they carefully hung it on the back of Betty's wagon. It was easy enough to do without even asking the wagon to stop, because the wagons rolled so slowly along the prairie. Mary sliced the creature's neck to let it bleed out and smiled at Betty. "We'll butcher it during lunch." She obviously had no problem butchering meat, but the idea turned Betty's stomach a little. She'd have to get over that, she was sure, but back east, they'd always lived in the city, and meat had come wrapped in paper from the butcher. Betty had no interest in butchering a deer, but knowing how wouldn't be a bad thing. There was a lot she could learn from Mary. "Are you going to settle where the others are?" Betty asked. Mary nodded emphatically. "Yup. My whole family will. I really can't wait to get there and claim our homesteads." She rubbed her hands together excitedly. "I can't either. Malcolm said we could settle near everyone else as well." Betty smiled. "Of course, we won't need as much property as everyone else." She hated the idea of letting a great deal of land lie fallow. Mary nodded, pursing her lips. "Claim it all though. As much as you can. You can rent out parts of it for other men to use for their fields or for their ranches. I think it would be really smart. You want to do everything you can to make it easier for yourselves financially as soon as we arrive." Just before lunch, Betty pointed to something off in the distance. "Is that Chimney Rock? Malcolm said we'd be seeing it soon." She was excited to know they'd reached something. It seemed some days as if they were like Moses, wandering around the wilderness in his efforts to find Israel. Mary looked and nodded. "I think it is. It's one of the things I've been watching for. Look at how majestic it looks." When the wagon stopped rolling, Betty hurried to Malcolm. "Did you see Chimney Rock?" "No." "Where?" She pointed to it off in the distance, and he smiled. "Yup, that would be it." "Good eye." "I thought so. I invited Penelope to supper tonight, and Mary shot a deer for us, so we'll have fresh meat." Why she felt the need to tell him everything that happened while they weren't together, she was unsure. "Who is Penelope?" "And I'll remember to thank Mary later. Penelope has no family with her. She's driving her own wagon." Malcolm nodded. "I believe I've seen her, but never actually met her. It's strange that we don't know everyone that's part of our company after almost 2 months on the trail." "It is. But it's good too. It gives me a goal to meet everyone on our wagon train before we cross the North Platte River." It was a rather lofty goal, given her shyness, but she was determined to make it work. "That's a good goal." He grinned at her. "You really are all about having new experiences, aren't you?" "I wasn't. You taught me that I need to be more involved in what's going on around me." "Thank you for that." She stood on tiptoe and kissed him quickly. "I've also arranged for Annie to spend the night with the Pruitts, so we can have our night on the prairie, if you'd like that." She knew he would, but it felt good to be able to give him choices. "If?" He laughed. "I would always like that. Every night would suit me fine." "Good," she said with a smile. "Now, let's have some of last night's supper for our noon meal, and then I'll help Mary butcher the buck she shot." "I'll help her butcher it. You have enough to do with just cooking it. Don't ever worry about butchering. I'm pretty good at cutting things. It's part of being a doctor and a surgeon." "Sounds good to me. I don't want to be part of that process one little bit." After their cold lunch, Malcolm helped with the butchering of the buck while Betty saw to the dishes. She had never been joyful about doing the dishes, and she'd added so much extra work for herself. She wondered if she'd lost her mind for a moment, but she knew she was doing the right thing by helping the people around her. It's what Jesus would have had her do without question. When it was time to start up again, Annie climbed into the back of the wagon, able to climb up with no problem even with her broken arm. Betty was amazed at how easy it seemed for her to move. Already she was adapting well to only being able to use one arm. "All right. I'll see you after you wake up. If you want to get down to walk, you call me. No jumping to the ground while the wagon is moving like last time." Annie grinned. It was going slow. It is always going slow, but I can still help. All right? At least until your arm has mended. Yes, Mama. Annie laid on her good side and closed her eyes. She was obviously tired from her morning of walking. Bernice was putting the boys in the back of the wagon and looking extremely annoyed as Betty was walking past. "Are you all right?" she asked her sister. Bernice nodded. "I'm going to be fine. The boys are just about to make me lose my mind, though. They have done everything mischievous they can possibly think to do today." "Do you want me to lie down with them?" Betty asked. "I could use the nap, and you could use the time away." Her sister had not really had any time away from her boys since Betty had married. The lack of breaks from the two little angels would make anyone crazy. She couldn't call them hellions even in her mind. "Are you sure? I didn't realize just how much I needed you around until you up and got married." Bernice made a face at her sister. Betty nodded, smiling. "I'm sure, but it's nice to be appreciated." "Thank you." Bernice kissed her cheek. "I don't know what I've done to deserve such a wonderful sister, but I'm glad you're willing." With that, Bernice hurried off before her sister could change her mind. Betty climbed into the back of the wagon with her nephews and saw them with their little heads together whispering. "None of that now. Split up." There wasn't really room for all three of them to lie down, so she had the boys lie as far apart as she could, and then she sat between them. No colluding needed to be happening on her watch. By the end of the day, she remembered why she preferred to walk than to ride in the wagon. The wagon was too bumpy. She felt a bit sick to her stomach as she got out of the vehicle and walked to her own wagon. She assigned her nephews to gather as many buffalo chips as they could to start her fire and her sisters, promising that the one who found the most got some of the dessert she made. Nothing motivated her nephews like sweets. Annie stood off to one side, frowning a bit. "What's wrong, Annie?" Betty asked. She wanted to be able to make her new daughter happy, but somehow it always seemed to elude her. "I should be collecting buffalo chips with the boys." Betty shrugged. "It would help if you could. Do you think you could do it with just one arm?" Annie nodded emphatically. "I can do anything." "All right. You can go collect them if you want to, but know that you don't have to." "I need to earn my keep," Annie said once again. "Annie, I thought you understood that I really don't expect you to earn your keep. I am your new mama, and I just want you to be happy in my family. That's earning your keep enough for us. If you want to help, I would really appreciate it because it makes my life a little easier. But if you don't want to, I won't force you. I'll ask you to do some chores at times, but it will never be about earning your keep." Annie nodded and walked away, presumably to collect buffalo chips. Betty wasn't certain she'd gotten through to the girl yet, but she certainly hoped she had. Malcolm joined her and saw all she was doing to get supper started. "What all are you making?" he asked, looking surprised. There was a great deal of mess surrounding Betty, and that was unlike her. "I'm making an apple pie, 5 loaves of bread, a roast with rice, carrots, and gravy, and some coffee. I'm waiting on my nephews to bring me buffalo chips to cook with." "That's too much for one meal," he said a little startled. "No one expects dessert every night. And I won't be making dessert every night, but Penelope is eating with us, and I want her to have something special." Before she'd married Malcolm, Betty had no idea how much she liked to do for others. Now she found she was constantly doing something for someone. He shook his head. Don't wear yourself out. We have another 1,500 miles to go. Have they only gone 500 miles in 2 months? I thought it was a 6-month journey. I got a nap this afternoon. Bernice didn't want to sit in the back of the wagon with the boys, so I did. Then she walked, and I got a little sleep. Not a lot, because with the boys, she'd needed to sleep with one eye open, but the rest from walking had been nice. Please be careful. He pressed a kiss to her lips. Is tonight our night to go out on the prairie? She nodded, grinning at him. Tomorrow night will be their turn again. I think I like our little arrangement. I know I do. He stretched. I'm going to go check on a couple of people, and then I'll be back. How long before supper? Give me about 2 hours. That gives me time to get the fire going and get the meat cooked. She knew that would be just about right for the meat, and the pie could cook while they ate, and she could serve it hot. It would work out just about right. When Penelope came to her fire, Betty smiled at her new friend and told her to sit. Penelope shook her head. No, I'm going to help. What can I do? Betty frowned. I have the meat and carrots on. I'm going to add the rice. I need to use a little of the fire for bread. She wasn't sure how to have someone else help her. Have you let the bread rise already? I have. Let me do the bread then. I've learned that doing it inside a big pot cooks it well. Do you have another big pot? I have one more for the rice. Betty had no idea what the other woman was talking about, but she'd let her help if she could. I'll go get mine. Trust me, you're going to love this. Penelope hurried off to her own wagon and came back with her big pot. She took the loaves of bread and put 2 into the pot, and then put the pot on the fire. I'll do 2 at once. I only need 1 for supper, so the other 3 can be done after if need be. Or while we eat. She didn't care when the bread was cooked, as long as she had some to go home with the Bedwells. 1 for supper, and the other 4 are? 2 for us to eat tomorrow, and then 2 for the Bedwells. Betty wasn't watching the other woman's face as she said the words, but she heard in her tone of voice that she didn't like it. Are the Bedwells eating with you as well? Yes, they are. They're eating with us every night now. I guess I should have told you that earlier. They'll be on their best behavior. Betty hoped the prospect of eating with the former captain and his boys didn't scare Penelope off, because she knew she wanted all of them there for supper. I suppose that's all right. May I ask why you're showing them kindness? Betty frowned for a moment, trying to think of the best answer. The boys had nothing to do with the bad behavior of their father. My husband asked me to show them kindness because they were having a hard time, and I realized they weren't eating. I couldn't let them not eat. I don't have it in me. Especially not when children are involved. Betty felt like she had to defend being kind to people, which was odd for her. Penelope nodded. That's a decent thing you're doing then. I will do my best to follow suit and show only kindness. I pray before I know they'll be here. It helps, Betty said with a smile. Then I'll do the same. Between the 2 of us and God, we can do anything we want to do. Chapter 8. Monday, May 24, Sup/Sup, 1852. I made a new friend today. It's become my mission to meet everyone in the company before we cross the North Platte River, and I introduced myself to a young woman who was going to Oregon on her own. She came from a family of slave owners in Virginia, and I'm doing my best not to judge her by her people. I don't believe people should ever own other people, but she can't help where she came from. She came to supper with us, and she showed me a new way to cook my bread over a campfire, which is absolutely wonderful. I can't wait to make it that way myself, because it will make my life easier. Mr. Bedwell was very insulting to her during the meal because he doesn't think women should go west without men to protect them. He laughed at her for thinking she could go alone. I wasn't pleased. I know I could never do it, but that doesn't mean no woman can do it. Afterward we washed dishes together, which was nice, and we talked about what he'd said. Penelope, that is. Not Mr. Bedwell. And had I mentioned her name is Penelope yet? Well, it is. Penelope Brainerd. I'm very happy I have gotten to know her a little, and I hope she and I will find a way to continue to be friends. She's made it plain she will never come to my fire for another meal, because she doesn't want to eat with Mr. Bedwell. Who can blame her? The bread Penelope showed Betty how to bake came out perfectly, and Betty was thrilled to have a new way to bake bread. It would make her life a bit easier while they were on the trail. Annie stood and watched as Betty and Penelope worked together with a frown on her face. What's wrong? Betty asked. I can't help, but I want to. Betty looked around for something for the girl to do. You could count the number of cups of rice for me to put into the pot. We need 4 cups. Annie seemed appeased by that, and she counted. I helped with supper. You did. Now you can go play if you'd like to. Betty was thrilled the girl was so happy to be able to help, even if it was in little ways. After Annie had run off, Penelope said, "Your daughter is sweet." Betty smiled and nodded. She really is. How did your first husband die? Betty frowned. I've never been married before. Oh. You think Annie is my real daughter? No, her parents died from cholera on our wedding night, and Malcolm and I decided we'd raise her as our own. She shrugged. It felt like the right thing to do, but she's a very sweet child. She was obviously taught well from infancy. You do so well with her. I just assumed she was yours. Betty shook her head. No. Malcolm is my first husband, and he's hopefully my only husband. I'd better be your only husband, Malcolm said as he strode into camp. You're already thinking of replacing me? Betty shrugged. You never know when you'll find someone better. She winked at him, so he would know she was teasing, but he shook his head at her. Why do I put up with your insolence, woman? Because I'm the best wife you have. You're the only wife I have. We're not on the Mormon trail. Penelope watched the couple together for a minute. I think if I could have a marriage like yours, I wouldn't think it was such a loathsome thing. The doctor looked at her for a moment. You must be Penelope. Betty told me you'd be having supper with us. Yes, I'm Penelope Brainerd. You're the woman who is alone on the trail, right? I think you're the only one in the whole camp. He knew he'd seen a woman alone in her wagon every morning as they lined up. No, there's one other. Her name is Trudy Brown. A lot of people confuse us for one another and think there's only one woman who is foolish enough to make this journey alone, but there are 2. Penelope shrugged. Trudy is nice enough, but she's not someone I enjoy taking meals with, though we did try at first. The former captain and his boys arrived then, and Betty served the meal for everyone. Annie came back as soon as Betty started dishing up plates, as she typically did. The girl did like to eat. Everyone praised Betty's cooking, which pleased her. Before she sat on a rock to eat her own meal, she accepted her basket back from the younger Bedwell boy. Thank you, Albert. Albert nodded. You'll fill it with bread again? Of course, I will. I said I would. Betty smiled at the boy, putting 1 loaf of bread into the basket immediately. Harvey, Mr. Bedwell's older son, looked at the basket. We get 2 loaves again, right? Yes, there are 2 more cooking now. Betty knew the boys were hungry, but they were being very particular about the amount of food she was giving them. While they ate, Malcolm did his best to steer the conversation. What made you decide to take off and head west, Penelope? There are a great deal more opportunities for a woman out west. I've always wanted to farm, and I can do that with free land from the government. In the East, I couldn't own the land even if I had the cash to buy it. I want to feel like I have the right to live my life as I see fit. Penelope took a sip of her coffee. Besides, my mother wanted me to start looking for a husband, and I didn't want to be any man's property. The former captain laughed. You'd be a man's property if you married in the West as well. In the West, I have the right to own my land, and the right to work it as I see fit. I'm quite content with moving out west. Betty was impressed with how calm Penelope was able to keep her voice after the insulting words. Betty wanted to ask the other woman how old she was, but she knew better. It was something she might be able to ask her privately, but not in front of others. What do you plan to do in the West? The captain asked, wrinkling his nose at the very idea of a woman out west alone. I'm going to farm, Penelope said softly. And I'm going to be the best farmer around. No one will ever take a woman farmer seriously, he said. I'd starve before I would purchase crops grown by a woman. Betty decided it was time to step in. She was ready to tell the man he and his boys would starve if she didn't feed them, but she thought better of it. I would take a woman farmer seriously. Is anyone still hungry? There's plenty more food. Mr. Bedwell didn't look as if he wanted to leave the topic alone, but he knew he was dependent upon Betty for food, so he dropped it. I would enjoy a little more rice and some more of the meat if you don't mind. Me too, Albert said. It's so nice to have real food again. Malcolm smiled at his wife, pleased with how she'd handled the situation. I'll get the food, he said, wanting to show the captain that a man could do a woman's job as well as a woman could do a man's. When they'd all eaten their fill, Betty served the pie. Did you make this with those dried apples again? Malcolm asked. I did. They have a purpose. This is delicious. I'm glad you found something to do with them, because I was at a complete loss. I'm thinking about making flapjacks in the morning with bits of the dried apple in them. Does that sound good? Before Malcolm had a chance to answer, Annie answered for him. Yes, please. That sounds delicious. Everyone laughed at the little girl and some of the tension disappeared. If you decide to do it, let me know what recipe you end up using, Penelope said. I haven't tried apples in my flapjacks yet, but it sounds delicious. It does to me too, Malcolm said. I wish I could find some fresh berries, but I really haven't seen any. Maybe soon. Betty had been on the lookout for berries since she and Margaret had first become friends, but they just hadn't appeared yet. After everyone had finished with the meal, Penelope got to her feet. Thank you so much for inviting me, Betty. May I help you with the dishes? Betty smiled. I'd like that a lot if you have time, but you don't have to. No, but I want to. Betty put the rest of the bread for the Bedwells into the basket before they started the dishes. After the family had walked away, she said, I'm so sorry for the way Mr. Bedwell reacted to you going west on your own. The man can be extremely difficult to get along with at times. He can. Penelope shook her head. He was saying all the same things my father said before I left Virginia. Whatever he thinks, I don't care. I'm going to have my own land, and I'm not going to use slaves to help me. Did your father own slaves? Betty asked. She'd always lived in New York, where slavery was illegal. She'd never considered that anyone in the company may have been around slaves, but half of the United States allowed slaves, so she wasn't sure why she was surprised. He did. He had a huge cotton plantation, and he said the only way it was possible to make as much money as he needed was by owning slaves. Penelope shook her head. When I was a little girl, a black woman nursed me, and her daughter and I were best friends. That daughter was sold when I was 10, because my father didn't like our friendship. I've hated slavery ever since. I don't blame you. Betty shook her head. I hope you find everything to your liking in the West. A group of us are planning to settle in the same area, so we will have friends and neighbors. We don't know what that area is yet, but I sure hope you'll join the rest of us there. Penelope smiled. I'm thankful for the invitation. As long as Mr. Bedwell doesn't settle there, I think I could be very happy. Betty laughed. I'm not sure he'll be able to settle down. I certainly don't think he'll find himself a wife with the way he talks to women, Penelope said. He's been very kind the other times he's been here. I don't know what made him talk to you like that this evening. I don't either, Penelope said. I just hope I don't have to cross paths with him often on this journey of ours. I suppose that means you won't be accepting any other dinner invitations. I suppose it does. I'm sorry. I have enjoyed your company immensely. Penelope sighed. I wish we could continue to have suppers together, but not with that man here. Perhaps we can spend some time at the dances. My husband plays the music, so I have little to do. She hadn't noticed Penelope at the one dance she'd been to, but she'd been rather wrapped up in Malcolm that night. Penelope nodded. I would adore that. After her new friend had left the campsite, Malcolm and Betty gathered their things so they could take Annie to the Pruitts, and then head out onto the prairie for their time together. Margaret was there to take Annie's blankets. The girls are excited you're staying with us tonight. Me too. Annie hurried off to find her friends. How was supper tonight? Margaret asked. She'd known about Penelope and the Bedwells all eating with Betty. It was all right, except Mr. Bedwell, who I still want to call the captain, was baiting Penelope. He was trying to convince her that a woman had no place out west except as a wife. Margaret shook her head. He told me the same thing when I wanted to go with my 2 young daughters. He said that without a man, I was doomed to fail. Of course, he did. Betty sighed. Malcolm really wants us to help Mr. Bedwell and the boys, and I want to make sure those boys are fed, but I don't like how the captain treats people. Not even a little bit. I agree. But the boys do need to be fed, and you are a wonderful cook. Thank you. Betty hugged her friend. And thank you for letting Annie spend the night with you again. Just so we get our turn tomorrow night. Betty nodded. Absolutely. She turned to Malcolm, and the two of them headed further out onto the prairie. Mr. Bedwell was rather rude to Penelope tonight. Yes, he was. He's not always a pleasant man, but he's not the horrible man people have made him out to be. I still believe we're doing the right thing by feeding him and the boys and being their friends when they have no one else. I agree. It would be nice if he could marry, but I'm not sure that will ever be possible in this company where we all know him. I'm not sure either. Malcolm shrugged. Is it too much work for you to feed them all? Too much? No, but it is significantly more work. I was thankful when Penelope offered to help with the dishes. I can understand that. When Annie's arm is better, do you think she'll be of any help? Yes, she'll be able to wipe them dry after I wash them, so it will help a lot. How much longer does she need to have the splint? Betty asked. She wasn't one who thought a child should have to earn their keep, but she had no problem giving the girl chores and teaching her to work. Another 5 weeks or so. It depends on how quickly it heals. He stopped walking and spread out the blanket he'd been carrying. Now, let's not talk about camp things any longer. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her passionately, and Betty was happy to oblige. Doing her wifely duty had become a great deal more pleasurable than she'd ever expected it to be. Betty hunted down Trudy Brown the next morning, wanting to get to know her a little better. This woman seemed much different than Penelope to Betty, though there was a passing resemblance in the way they wore their hair, which must be why people thought they were the same person. "Hello. I'm Betty Bentley," Betty said as she approached the other woman early the next day, before they left on their day's travels. Miss Brown nodded. "Trudy Brown. It's nice to meet you. I'm fascinated by the women who feel like they can go west alone, without the help of any man." Betty smiled sweetly, hoping she could become friends with the other woman. Working hard at meeting new people had given her a confidence she'd never really had before. "That so?" "It is. What are you planning to do when we reach Oregon?" The woman shrugged. "No real plans. I just had no desire to marry or to see my pa stare at me every day as if he thought I was wasting my life. So, I left." "I see." Betty smiled. "How would you like to join my family for supper tonight?" "I'd love to get to know you better." "I suppose I could do that. Are you a good cook?" Betty laughed. "I'm a decent cook, for certain. My husband and daughter seem to love everything I make." "I guess I could do that then." "Tonight?" "Let's make it tomorrow night instead," Betty said. She'd rather be able to space their beans out, and she didn't want to serve a guest beans. "All right then. I'll be there tomorrow evening at supper time." "Thanks for the offer, Mrs. Bentley." "Please, call me Betty." "All right." The woman didn't offer her Christian name in return, but Betty didn't let that faze her. She hurried back to where the other women and children were gathering for their daily walk. From what Betty understood, in the beginning of their journey, Mary and Hannah had watched over the children whose mothers couldn't walk with them for whatever reason. Now that was no longer necessary as all the children seemed to walk together, and they played games along the way. Betty linked her arm with Margaret's, happy to be walking with her friend. "I want to start asking if we're there yet, but I think I should probably wait until we at least leave the Platte River." Margaret laughed. "You sound like Sally. She's been asking me that every day since we left Independence." I'm tired of the question, but I can't blame her, because this journey does seem to be taking forever. "I refuse to complain, though," Betty said. "It's a beautiful day, and we're walking toward our futures." Margaret smiled. "Those clouds are making me a little nervous. It looks like we're going to have some serious rain soon." Betty shrugged. "Better than bathing in the river, right?" "I suppose it is." Margaret's predictions were true, and around mid-morning there started a rainstorm so bad, the wagons had to stop, because the drivers couldn't really see where they were going well enough to keep moving. The families who had enough room in their wagons took shelter inside them, and several people took shelter under their wagons. Betty huddled in inside the family wagon with Annie and Malcolm. Annie sighed. "What are we supposed to do now?" "Let's have our noon meal a little early," Betty suggested. "We would have stopped in 30 minutes anyway." She pulled out the food from the night before, and they ate it in the tight space. "We're going to have beans tonight." Annie frowned. "I hate beans. We have to eat them all the time." "Yes, we do. They last longer than any other food." "Then we should eat them at the end of the journey," Annie said. "I don't want to eat beans. If we don't eat some now, then we'll really hate beans in a few months. We should be thankful we have food in our bellies." The Bedwells had nothing to eat for a while. Annie frowned, but she ate her meal quietly. She obviously didn't want to care that they would hate beans more later if they didn't space them out with other meals. "Maybe Mrs. Hastings will shoot some meat later, and we'll have to have meat for supper," she finally said. "If she does, it'll be best if we dry it." "Then we can have meat later on," Malcolm said. He reached out and stroked Betty's arm, letting her know silently that he approved of her explanations with Annie. "Beans are yucky," Annie said as she finished eating and took a piece of bread with butter. "I'm going to make cornbread to go with them tonight. I thought maybe I'd put just a bit of honey in the cornbread," and then we can enjoy that part of the meal. That sounds good, Annie said. I'll eat more of that and less beans. Betty shook her head. She had no idea how to get through to the child and convince her that eating beans wasn't a form of torture. The rain kept coming down. Betty set the dishes on some oilcloth outside the wagon to clean them, and she climbed back in, sitting leaning back against Malcolm, who wrapped his arms around her. At least we get to listen to the rain. The rain seemed to be starting to ease a little when a young man stuck his head in the back of their wagon. Ruby is having the baby, he said. Come quick, Doc. She's hurting bad. Does she want me or the midwife? Malcolm asked, reaching for his bag. She didn't say. But if she's hurting, she needs a doctor. Malcolm smiled. All right, Freddie. I'll check on her, but you may find she would rather have Mrs. Mitchell. Often women prefer not to have men present during childbirth. They don't know what they're thinking. They're in pain and need a doctor. Freddie waited as the doctor climbed down and led the way to his wagon. Betty decided to follow as well. You stay put, she told Annie. I'm going to see if I can help. Annie nodded. I'm just going to nap. Sounds good. Betty climbed down and followed behind the men, sloshing through the mud. Malcolm stuck his head in the back of the wagon. How are you doing, Mrs. Jackson? Your husband said you need me because you're in pain, but you can choose me or Mrs. Mitchell. Either of us will help you. Mrs. Jackson frowned. I'd rather have Mrs. Mitchell. A man shouldn't be helping a woman with childbirth. Malcolm nodded. I'll go and fetch Mrs. Mitchell then. If there are complications, she'll have to get me, but you should be fine. You're young and healthy. He was never offended when a woman preferred a midwife. To him, it only made sense. Betty was drenched by the time she joined him, but he shook his head. She wants Mrs. Mitchell, which was what I expected. Most women really don't want a man around when they're having a baby. I can see that. She wasn't sure how she'd feel with a man other than her husband seeing her that way. In fact, she didn't think she even wanted her husband to see her. It was good it was always dark when they enjoyed one another. I'll go get Mrs. Mitchell. You get back in the wagon with Annie. Betty didn't have to be told twice. She was dripping wet, and she had no desire to catch cold. At least it was a warm day, and the rain felt good on her skin. She climbed into the wagon and sat down, reaching for a blanket to dry off with. She hated being wet and fully clothed. Stripping wasn't the answer though. She sat for a moment, thinking about how amusing it would be if Malcolm came back to the wagon and she was naked. She had no idea what he would think of such a thing. When Malcolm did come back, he grabbed another of the blankets and tried to find a place to sit. Unfortunately, the little space they had was taken up by Annie, who was sprawled across the floor of the wagon without a care in the world. I'm glad we have her, he said softly. She took up more than her share of room, but she was a bright spot in their lives. Me too. But we're going to be mighty uncomfortable in a few hours if the rain doesn't stop. Chapter 9. Tuesday, May 25, Sup, th/Sup, 1852. We lost ground today. It was bound to happen sooner or later, but we had a real gully washer of a rainstorm, bad enough that we couldn't see to drive. By the time it stopped raining, it was time to stop for the day, and it was too muddy to even think about continuing anyway. I'll be thankful if we can get out in the morning. We would have had to stop anyway, because we had a berth in our company, but I was not asked to attend. Mrs. Jackson wanted to have a midwife instead of a doctor, and Mrs. Mitchell was the one to help with the birthing. A healthy baby girl was born, for which we are all thankful. As strongly as I feel about helping the Bedwells, the former captain is making me angrier by the day. I have got to come up with a solution, because he is treating my wife as if she owes him the food she makes for him. He and his boys brought the pot she filled with food last night back to her dirty, and then they had the gall to complain that she hadn't made dessert. As if it's her duty to cook for them, clean for them, and make them dessert. I'm thankful she does those things for Annie and me, and I've even offered to continue taking meals with Mrs. Pruitt so she won't have to go through so much work. Bedwell seems to think he can eat at our campfire, have my wife cook for him, and never pay a dime. I don't care about payment, but if he's going to treat my wife as a serving girl, then he needs to be paying her, and he needs to be paying her well. Though, I never want her to feel as if she must earn a living, so I'm filled with confusion over the entire situation. One thing is for certain. He will not continue to treat her that way in my presence. I'm not certain yet how I will prevent it, but I know that I will stop the madness. Soon. When the rain finally let up, it was time for supper, and they'd lost most of a day of travel. Of course, that's why they'd worked so hard to stay on schedule. Betty got out of the wagon and had to find a way to use a bit of the dry timber they kept in the wagon to start a fire. Even the buffalo chips would be too wet to try to cook over. She'd had been soaking for hours, though, and she got out, started her fire, sliced a bit of the bacon to add to the beans, and then she put them over the fire to cook. While she was mixing up the cornbread, Malcolm helped Annie down from the wagon. I'm going to go check and see how Mrs. Jackson is coming with her delivery. I need to make sure everything is going well, and I'm not needed. Yes, of course, Betty said. She looked at Annie, who was eyeing her curiously. Go ahead and play with your friends. I'll make supper. Annie nodded, hurrying off. Betty smiled, pleased the child listened to her about playing with her friends without her having to insist repeatedly. Usually Annie argued that she should stay and help with supper, even when there was no need to do so. She put the bread she'd had rising all day onto the stove fire in her spare pot, while she got the cornbread into the frying pan. She'd do 2 more loaves of regular bread and 1 more cast-iron skillet worth of cornbread before she was done. Now that she was feeding 2 families, it was harder to cook everything, but it was worth it. Seeing other people go hungry wasn't something she ever wanted to do again. By the time everyone came back, the beans and cornbread were ready, and she had the 2 loaves for the Bedwells set aside, and she was cooking her loaves for her own family. Albert Bedwell brought her a dirty cook pot and an empty basket for her to fill. Betty frowned. She knew the former captain had no cooking skills, but surely he could scrub out a pot as easily as she could. She said nothing though, simply filling the pot with some of the rainwater they'd managed to catch and putting it on the fire to boil away any cooked-on mess. She hated scrubbing pots that no one had bothered to soak. When Malcolm came back from checking on Mrs. Jackson, he looked at the pot on the fire. Where did that come from? She had her usual pot on the fire boiling water, but this one was different. That's the pot I sent food with the Bedwells last night, Betty said, her voice mild. She was more annoyed than she probably should be with Mr. Bedwell, but it wouldn't do good to say anything. Malcolm was determined to be kind to the Bedwell family, though it was up to her to do all the work. Malcolm looked confused for a moment, but then he seemed to understand. I see. He wanted to tell her not to do the other man's dishes for him, but he knew it would fall on deaf ears. How is Mrs. Jackson? Betty asked, determined to change the subject rather than start any kind of argument. The extra work wasn't something that would kill her, though she thought it was ridiculous it was being asked of her. She's doing all right. No baby yet, and Mrs. Mitchell has assured me I'll be called in if I'm needed. Mr. Bedwell looked at Malcolm. Why would you be needed? Having babies is women's work. Yes, of course it is, but sometimes there are problems, and a doctor needs to be called in. Malcolm walked over and picked up the empty bread basket, putting the 2 hot loaves in for the other man and his sons. He wasn't certain why the boys couldn't put the loaves that were sitting out into their own basket, but for some reason, they seemed incapable of doing so. He handed the basket to the younger boy. Before gathering the bowls, they would eat the rice and beans in. "The beans smell good," Malcolm said. "Did you use a new seasoning?" "I'm trying to make them a little more palatable, because we're all sick of beans. I found some red pepper in with Annie's family's things, and thought it might make the beans a little better. They will most definitely be a little spicier." "Sounds good to me," Malcolm said. "I'm always willing to try new things." Annie frowned. "And did you put honey in the cornbread like you said you would, Mama?" Betty could tell she was really upset about the beans again, but she could be appeased with honey. "I did. And I'll put extra honey and fresh butter on yours." "How does that sound?" "You can put some on mine too," Mr. Bedwell said, and his two sons quickly agreed that they wanted extra honey and butter as well. Malcolm felt anger boiling up inside of him. This family had started treating his wife as if she was required to feed them and clean for them. Now she had to put butter and honey on their cornbread? "Why don't you just put the butter and honey out, Betty? Then everyone can add their own." Then he looked at Annie with her broken arm. "Well, Annie will need help, but the others can take care of their own." Mr. Bedwell didn't look happy, but he nodded. "My wife always did those things for me." Malcolm nodded. "I wish she was still here, and she could." Surely the man could see that with his own wife gone, he couldn't expect other people's wives to do her work for her. "I do too. She really spoiled me." Mr. Bedwell looked at his boys, who both nodded. "She did all the cooking and cleaning, and we never had to carry our own food across camp," Albert said. Betty didn't bother looking up as she fixed Annie's food and made sure her daughter was fed first, and then she dished up bowls for everyone else. Finally, she served herself and sat down on a rock, ready to keep her head down, so she wouldn't respond in anger to anything the captain said in anger. Anger seemed to be the only emotion she felt for the man. Malcolm frowned at Albert. "Does that mean you think my wife should carry food for you?" He couldn't believe anyone would even suggest such a thing after all the extra work Betty went through to feed them. Albert shrugged. "Pa said a good wife would be kinder to her guests, but I don't really know either way. My wife is exceedingly kind to her guests. She makes extra bread for you every day. She makes extra food and sends you home with some every evening so you won't be hungry the following day. What more do you think she should do?" Malcolm couldn't believe just how exasperating the Bedwells were being. Betty was doing all she could to make sure their family was fed, and it wasn't enough? Harvey shrugged. "She could invite us for breakfast every morning. We have to eat bread and dried meat instead of flapjacks and Johnny cakes." Betty kept her head down. She felt like she should offer, but it was hard enough spending one meal a day with the Bedwells. At first, they'd seemed to appreciate what she did for them, but now, they acted as if she owed them even more. If Malcolm asked her to cook breakfast for them, she would, but she wouldn't like it. "For breakfast, you eat the bread my wife baked and the meat my wife dried. I would think you would be thankful you had a meal instead of saying she should do more for you." Malcolm wanted to tell them to leave their camp and never return, but he couldn't watch them go hungry. "We're very thankful for our meal," Mr. Bedwell said. "I just thought as a newly married man, you'd want some tips on how to train your wife." At that moment, it was all Malcolm could do not to throw the Bedwells out of his camp. Of course, then he'd be back to worrying about their nutrition or lack thereof. He decided it would be best if he stopped arguing and simply ate his supper. He'd find a solution to their problem, and soon. He couldn't let Betty continue to go through meal after meal like this. As soon as the meal was over, Betty washed out the pot she'd had boiling on the stove and gave it to the captain, filled with their food for the next day. "I hope you enjoy it." She smiled sweetly as she wished they'd choke on it. She immediately regretted even thinking such a thing, but they were making her crazy. "There's no dessert tonight?" Harvey asked. We like it when you make us dessert. Not tonight, Betty said. Though she was considering making some for just her family as the others left the camp. She wouldn't be feeding the Bedwells dessert anytime soon. Not after the way they'd been talking to her that night. As soon as they were gone, she immediately started washing up from the dishes, while Malcolm once again left the camp to check on Mrs. Jackson. He was gone an extraordinarily long time, and Annie was in bed with her two friends, and the dishes had long been taken care of when he finally arrived back. He erected the tent he shared with Betty, and they climbed into it in silence. "How is Mrs. Jackson?" Betty finally asked. "Oh, she had the baby. Little girl. Both are healthy." He'd walked for a good long while after checking on the new mother and baby, trying to figure out how to deal with the problems the Bedwells were causing for his wife. Betty meant the world to him, and he wasn't going to let her be mistreated, even if it meant an entire family going hungry, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. "Oh, that's wonderful." Betty was relieved everything had worked out for Mrs. Jackson, a sweet young woman who couldn't be more than 18. "Yes." Malcolm rolled over with his back to his wife and closed his eyes. He was still seething over the way the former captain and his two sons had treated his wife, but he felt as if he'd gotten her into a bad situation. She shouldn't have to put up with the way they were talking to her when she was the one doing them a favor and providing them with sustenance they wouldn't otherwise receive. He would have to think about what to do and how to handle things the following day. He wasn't going to let them continue on as they had been. When Malcolm turned his back to her, Betty turned the other way, feeling tears stinging the backs of her eyes. Surely Malcolm understood that she couldn't stop feeding the other family no matter how rude the captain and his boys were becoming. It was her job as a Christian woman to help them out. How was her only question? Did he blame her for the situation? She hoped not, because she didn't know what she could have done differently. Betty rose earlier than usual the following morning, after a horrible night of tossing and turning. She knew her day would be particularly hard after she'd barely slept, but she had no choice but to keep going. Perhaps she could nap in the wagon when Annie did, but even that wasn't appealing to her. She just wanted to lose herself in a book and forget the world around her. Of course, that was her answer to all of life's troubles. Forget about them and lose herself in the life of some random heroine. She'd done better about living her life the past couple of weeks, but still, she wanted to slip into old habits. She made the special flapjacks with apple in them for breakfast, along with some bacon. She knew at least Annie would be thrilled with the meal, even if Malcolm wasn't especially fond of it. When the shot rang out to awaken the camp, and everyone began to stir, Mr. Jackson came hurrying into camp and pulled Malcolm away. "We need you to come quick." Betty had hoped to be able to at least speak with her husband for a while before the wagon started rolling again, but perhaps that wouldn't be possible that day. But it would be possible for her to read a book instead. That was probably the answer. After the breakfast dishes were done and the bread was rising, she sat down and reread a favorite book. What else did she have to do when her husband wasn't around, and her daughter was off playing with her friends? Just before time to start out, Malcolm came back into camp, grabbing bacon and wrapping the flapjacks around it. Instead of talking, he ate the meal in 2 bites and hitched up the team of oxen. She saw there was some blood on his shirt, but he didn't seem to want to speak, so she didn't ask. Betty joined the others, wondering exactly what she'd done to deserve her husband's anger. As soon as she figured out what it could possibly be, she'd work on fixing it. Until then, she'd walk, but she wouldn't talk with the others. All morning she walked apart from the others, her mind going to various ways she could convince Malcolm she wasn't as bad as he seemed to think her. She would make extra food for the Bedwells. That might be the answer. Of course, she had no desire to be even kinder to them than she had been, but if it would appease Malcolm, it would be worth it. Or she could, well, she didn't know what she could do. She did know that there was no way they were going to enjoy themselves that night when it was their turn for a night of passion. How could they? They weren't even speaking. As Malcolm drove, he formulated a plan that would solve his problems with the way his wife was being treated. Now that he had an answer, it would be simple to follow through with it. He had to talk to Betty, but now that they were underway, he wouldn't be able to until they stopped for their break and the noon meal. The co-captains seemed to be in favor of keeping to a normal schedule instead of trying to break themselves, making up for the 15 miles they hadn't covered the day before. They were going to try for an extra mile or so per day, and they would call it good. He was thankful the new captains were level-headed in a way the old one never had been. When they finally stopped for the noon meal, Betty served the cold beans, bacon, and cornbread from the previous night. She'd taken to putting extra bread in a cloth bag every morning for Malcolm so he would have something to eat while he drove. Little Annie seemed distracted, but she ate her meal without too much complaint. She wrinkled her nose at the beans, but she ate them, which was all Betty worried about. "I've come up with a solution," Malcolm said to Betty, who looked at him, her eyes full of hurt. A solution? Did he want to divorce her already? What kind of solution was he talking about? He frowned at the look in her eyes. "Are you all right?" She seemed to have gone from a happy wife to one who was miserable in less than a day. What had happened while he was preoccupied with solving the Bedwell problem? Betty shrugged. "I suppose I am. You've all but ignored me since supper last night, and I'm not sure what I've done to offend you, but I seem to have." She just realized she loved him a little more with every breath she took. With every beat of her heart. He made her want to keep going, and now that he was angry, she wanted to do nothing but give up. Finding the elephant wasn't nearly as important as living with the rest of her heart intact. "You can't think I'm upset with you." Malcolm couldn't fathom why she would think such a thing. He'd never done anything to indicate anger toward her. Women's minds didn't seem to work properly. What else could I think? Betty closed her eyes to regain her composure. "How is Mrs. Jackson?" "I didn't see her walking this morning." He didn't like the change in topic, but he decided to accept it, for now. He'd talk with the former captain and tell him the new plan, and then he'd tell Betty. She was bleeding more than she should have been this morning, and we're worried about her. She's riding for at least a day or two, and we're hoping she'll be all right. The baby is doing fine. Betty nodded. "I'm glad the baby is all right. I'll say a prayer for Mrs. Jackson." He watched her as they finished their meal, worried about whatever was making her so sad. He wanted to help, but he really didn't know how. First, he had to deal with the situation with the Bedwells, and then he'd figure out his wife. If it was possible to understand what a woman was thinking, and he wasn't sure it was. Chapter 10. Wednesday, May 26, Sup/Sup, 1852. I'm so confused. Malcolm and I have been doing fine, and suddenly, he stopped speaking to me. I would understand it if I'd done something unkind or burned his supper. Any reason would help me, but I can't figure it out at all. I think he probably has realized I'm not the woman he thought I was, and he no longer wants me to be his wife. I'm almost afraid to find out what the real problem is, but I can't go on wondering for the rest of my life. Trudy Brown is coming to supper tonight, and though she isn't nearly as friendly as Penelope, I have hopes that we'll be close acquaintances at least. I just hope the tension between Malcolm and myself doesn't make for a difficult meal. It's bad enough when it's just the Bedwells, but we're adding in a less than cordial woman, and I fear there will be problems. I pray there are not. And I pray that I figure out what is wrong with Malcolm. I love him too much to see him this angry with me all the time. As soon as the company stopped for the day, Malcolm went to check on Mrs. Jackson, who seemed to be doing better, thank heavens. Then he went to speak with Mr. Bedwell. Bedwell saw him approaching and raised a hand in greeting. "Hey, Bentley." What can I do for you? I'll be seeing you at supper in just a short while. Couldn't wait to talk to me? No, you won't be seeing me at supper. Malcolm took a deep breath. I don't like how you talk to my wife. I worry about the nutrition of your family, though, so I'm not going to ask her to stop cooking for you and your boys. Instead, if you bring a clean pot at supper time every evening, she will fill it and give you 2 loaves of bread. If the pot isn't clean, or if you don't speak kindly to her, you won't receive any food. It's as simple as that. He didn't care how the former captain felt about his edicts. His wife would not be mistreated. Mr. Bedwell frowned at him. I'm really not sure what you think I've done wrong. Malcolm balled up both fists in anger, but he kept them at his sides. I happen to love my wife, and I really don't like the way you talk to her as if she's the hired help. She's not being paid. She's feeding your family out of the goodness of her heart, doing double the work, simply so you don't starve. Instead of being grateful, you complain that she hasn't made dessert or that she doesn't carry your food across camp. Surely the man would be able to see what an ass he was being with it explained so clearly. Mr. Bedwell shook his head. You haven't been married very long. You really don't understand how marriage works. For the first little while, you must train your wife that all men are her betters, and she needs to serve them with a smile. After a little while, she understands and simply does as she's told. It's that simple. Malcolm could no longer resist. Even though he was a peaceful man who believed in doing everything he could to heal others, he pulled back his fist and punched Mr. Bedwell in the nose. Bedwell grabbed his nose, staring at Malcolm in shock. There was blood pouring out from under his hand and down his shirt. Why did you do that? You will treat my wife with respect. If you want food, bring a clean pot at supper time. She will not be scrubbing it out again. With that, Malcolm turned to walk back to camp, wanting to shake out his hand for the pain he was feeling, but he wouldn't give Bedwell the satisfaction of seeing him do it. He was angrier than he could ever remember being, and it was all he could do to walk away and not hit the man again. No matter how much it hurt his hand, he wanted to pummel the man into oblivion. When he got back to camp, he saw someone he'd never seen before, and he frowned. He hadn't realized there were going to be guests. He'd have to talk to Betty after their evening meal. He wanted to explain everything to her, and tell her the solution he'd found for the Bedwell problem, but with someone else there, he didn't think it was the right time. There'd been no fresh meat that day, so Betty was making a gravy with the dried buffalo. She would serve it over rice, and she knew her family would be happy with the tasty meal. As she cooked, she talked to Miss Brown, who had proven to be quite prickly. She had no idea why the woman wouldn't talk to her, but no matter what she did, she couldn't get her to be friendly at all. Would you care for apple cake for dessert? Betty asked. I'd be happy to whip one up for us all. Trudy shook her head. You don't need to try to sweeten me up. The scowl never left her face, making Betty wonder if something had happened to make it permanently pinched up that way. Betty wasn't sure what to say to that. I will probably still make one for my family because they enjoy having the occasional dessert. If you decide you want a piece, just let me know. The meal was done except for the cake, and Betty mixed the batter while Trudy sat watching her. Why do you feel like you need to make people happy with food? Trudy asked. I don't, but I do feel the need for my family to eat. If they must eat, why shouldn't the food be to their liking? Betty had no idea why the other woman was being unpleasant, but she had a feeling their evening meal with Trudy and the Bedwells was going to be particularly horrible. She wanted to apologize to her family immediately for their presence. Betty had never thought she would regret asking someone to supper. Where's that little orphan girl you took in? Shouldn't she be helping? She needs to earn her keep. Trudy looked around, seemingly for Annie. That was it for Betty. She couldn't stand anything being said against Annie, especially by someone who didn't know her. I didn't take her in so she would help out and earn her keep. I happen to love her, and I plan to raise her as my own child. She will not be forced into indentured servitude simply because she was unfortunate enough to lose her parents at a young age. If you think that's why an orphan child should be taken in, then I don't see us having any sort of possibility of friendship in the future. Stay for supper if you like or go if you like. But never talk about my daughter that way again. Betty wanted to kick the other woman or throw something at her. Would pulling hair be better? Malcolm hid a smile as his beautiful and usually timid wife spoke to the other woman. It was clear she was willing to stand up for those he loved, and he wanted to applaud her, but he knew it would only make an already tense situation worse. Trudy stood up. I don't think there's any need for me to stay. Good evening. She nodded at Malcolm as she left the camp. Malcolm opened his mouth to speak as the other woman left, but a little whirlwind came out of nowhere and threw herself at Betty, almost knocking his wife into the fire. You really want me? Annie cried out, sobbing as she buried her face against Betty's breast. I keep telling you that, Betty said, wrapping her arms around the little girl. You're my daughter now, and you'll be treated the same as any other children we have. I love you, Mama. I love you too, Annie. There were tears in Betty's eyes as they met Malcolm's over the little girl's head. Malcolm walked over and wrapped his arms around both of them, feeling like his life was perfect in that moment. No, they hadn't yet reached Oregon. No, they weren't yet halfway. But he had the people he loved in his arms, and nothing more could possibly matter. Betty sniffled and said, Supper's done. All I have to do is put the apple cake on the fire, and we'll eat that for dessert. It's best hot anyway. She looked around, frowning. Where are the Bedwells? It was bad enough they didn't speak kindly to her, but they were late now as well. As if on cue, Albert approached with the empty breadbasket and a cookpot. Betty took the cookpot and peered inside, thrilled to see it was clean. Where are your father and your brother? She asked, confused. They're at our camp. I'm to get the food and leave without being rude to you in any way, because Pa doesn't want the doc to take away our food. Albert stood quietly as he waited for Betty to fill the pot he'd brought as well as the basket. When she handed him the food back, he nodded his head politely. We're very thankful for your kindness, ma'am. Betty looked at Malcolm. What was that about? She asked. She had no idea what was going on, but Malcolm seemed to. I've told Bedwell that he's no longer welcome at our campfire. We'll continue to feed them as long as they are polite to you, but one cross word, and their meals are done. Malcolm was thrilled with the solution he'd come up with, and he just hoped she would be as well. Why did you do that? She asked. She was ecstatic he'd stood up for her that way, but why would he when he'd obviously been angry with her? Because no one is going to speak to the woman I love the way he's been speaking to you. I'm not putting up with it for even another minute. It's ridiculous that you cook for him, clean his pot, and have to put up with his rudeness all at the same time. You do more than you should for me and everyone else. He can be kind to you, or he can go back to trying to cook for himself and his boys. Wait, she stared at him for a moment. Was he saying what she thought he was saying? You love me? She knew she loved him, and she was excited at the very idea he might feel the same for her. Malcolm stared at her as if she was daft for just a moment. Why do you think I married you? How could she not have known he was in love with her? The woman truly made no sense to him at all. I thought you were looking for meals, and other things. She couldn't come right out and say marital relations with little Annie listening. Well, those things are just bonuses. I married you because I'm in love with you. Betty smiled and walked around the fire, wrapping her arms around him. I love you too. I thought you were angry with me, and that's why you weren't talking to me last night. Now she had to wonder again what his problem had been. Why would he suddenly quit speaking to her? He held her close, resting her cheek atop his head. Last night, I was grappling with the problem that was the bedwells. I was hoping to find a way to be able to keep them fed, but keep you from being disrespected. I came up with a solution finally, but I couldn't get it off my mind. I really didn't decide what to do until I was driving this morning. I had no idea that's what was wrong with you. Why didn't you say something? If he'd just communicated with her, she wouldn't have gone through 24 hours of anguish. Because I was embarrassed, I didn't have a solution. Besides, when I am working on a problem, I tend to get quiet and think of nothing else. When I have a solution, I start talking again. He shrugged. I've always done things that way. I see. I wish I'd known that yesterday, so I wouldn't have spent the night tossing and turning and thinking you were trying to figure out how to divorce me. Divorce you? I'm never letting you go. He pressed his lips to her ear. Isn't it our night on the prairie tonight? She laughed. Yes, it most definitely is. She turned and saw little Annie watching them. I think we need to feed our daughter. Now that she was more confident in her marriage, it would be easy to concentrate on feeding the people she loved. Sounds good to me. Although, I have a hunger that has nothing to do with food. Betty smiled. You are not the only one. Her heart began to race as she anticipated her time alone with him in just a short while. As they ate, Betty saw that Annie was acting a little differently. Are you all right, Annie? I am. Annie shrugged. I just don't want to help with the dishes tonight. Do I have to? I've never made you help with the dishes, Betty said. Why do you think I'll make you tonight? The child made no sense sometimes. Annie shrugged with her good shoulder. I just want to make sure. Since I know you love me, I don't think I have to worry about helping as much. Betty laughed. You can help sometimes, but not until after your arm is better. Then you're going to have to help more around camp. The child wasn't going to get off with no chores at all, but she wouldn't feel like an indentured servant if Betty had anything to say about it. All right. But I'll still have time for my friends? Yes, you will still have time with your friends. You'll have as much time for them as they have for you. They do chores, just as you'll be expected to do chores. Does that work? Annie nodded. Yes. Am I sleeping in Amanda and Sally's tent tonight? Yes, you are. Do you like sleeping there? Betty worried about their strange arrangement, and she hoped Annie didn't mind. The girls had to wonder why they bounced back and forth between the two couples every night. I do. And I like when they sleep with us. It's like having sisters. Malcolm smiled. Someday you'll have real brothers and sisters. Will you like that? He could picture Betty big with his child. And he would happily adopt more children as well. Children who would not be treated as servants. As long as I don't have to change diapers, Annie said. We'll try to remember that's a task you won't enjoy, Betty said, shaking her head. It seemed that now that Annie knew she was really wanted and loved, she wasn't afraid to say much. After she'd finished the dishes, Malcolm and Betty took Annie over to stay with the Pruitts. Margaret took one look at Betty's face and nodded. I was hoping you'd work things out over supper. Betty has looked gloomy all day. Betty laughed. Yes, we've worked things out. All is right with our world. Good. Enjoy your night. Margaret hugged her friend. We'll take good care of Annie. I know you will. Malcolm and Betty held hands as they walked out into the open prairie. When she squeezed his hand, he winced, and she looked at him with surprise. Why does your hand hurt? Malcolm was happy it was dark, and she couldn't see his face turn red. I hit Mr. Bedwell and hurt my hand a little. More than a little, but he wasn't about to admit that to her. Betty laughed. Because of the way he treated me? Because of the way he treats all women. The man needs someone to punch him in the nose every day. You punched him in the nose? Betty loved the idea of Malcolm hitting someone for her. Malcolm laughed sheepishly. I think I broke his nose, to be honest. There was blood everywhere, and I didn't even bother to look at it. I just turned and walked away. I think that's wonderful. Thank you for defending my honor. He dropped the blanket he was carrying on the ground and pulled her close. I love you. There was nothing else I could do. I love you too. I can't believe how happy you've made me in such a short amount of time. Thank you for making me leave my literary world and join the real world. So, you're not going to spend the next 50 years with your nose in a book? He asked, grinning. Well, I didn't say that. But I will do my best to make sure my family is taken care of before the books are read. That's all I can ask.